Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's World Council of Credit Unions webinar. My name is Liz Stanislawski, and I am the Director of Communications for WOCU. I'm excited to introduce today's session. As the world recognizes Earth Day this month, the future direction of climate policy and regulation still remains uncertain in many markets. Today's panel will explore how geopolitical shifts are shaping climate regulations, share examples of how credit unions and financial cooperatives are responding in different countries, and offer practical insights to help institutions prepare for what's next. Before we begin, just a couple of brief housekeeping notes. We're pleased to be offering this webinar in both Spanish and Portuguese, so please be sure to choose your preferred language in the settings below. You can do that by going to the bottom of your screen and clicking the ellipses above the More button. If you do have questions during the presentation, please also use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many questions as time allows. This session is being recorded and will be available on YouTube later this week. Now I'm pleased to introduce Erin O'Hearn, International Advocacy and Regulatory Counsel for World Council of Credit Unions. She will be leading the panel discussion today. Erin, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Liz. And I'm actually going to invite our three panelists here to join us on camera. So we have Kathleen Kraus, Deputy Head of the Department of Prudential and Foreign Exchange Regulation at the Central Bank of Brazil. We also have Victoria Mainprize, Vice President, Policy Research and General Counsel at the Canadian Credit Union Association. And finally, Paul Andrews, Vice President of International Advocacy here at the World Council of Credit Unions. So a big thank you to all three of you for joining this panel. I am very eager to have this discussion today and couldn't think of three better people to have this discussion with. So really appreciate you all joining us here today. As Liz mentioned, this month we celebrated Earth Day, which is one of the largest internationally recognized holidays and certainly deserves its attention. But also because climate policies have really experienced significant shifts back and forth globally, especially over the past several years, which can be both challenging and frustrating and confusing for credit unions as they decide how to incorporate some of these changes and these shifts into their strategic plans. So we know that credit unions are feeling the effects of climate change as well as their members continue to feel those effects. We've seen a lot of credit unions out front working on products and services to support their communities, to help mitigate and adapt to climate change and really create that climate resiliency. But they're also having to manage that financial impact at the same time. And I think as we talk about these policies, I think my hope is that this will be helpful for credit unions as they start to think about, okay, how do we advocate for appropriate policies in our own country related to climate resilience and managing these risks that we're seeing? How are we preparing our organizations to adapt to these continuing changes and shifts? And then allowing them to really, in turn, focus on helping their members. So I'm very grateful for all three of you to join this conversation today. As all three of you come from different countries, different backgrounds, and work for different organizations, I'm hoping that each of you, I'd like to take a few minutes here at the start of this discussion to ask each of you to introduce yourselves, share a few words about how your organization has been involved in climate policy, educating credit unions on climate risks and other work that you're doing around climate resilience and financial safety and soundness. So Victoria, I may ask you of the three panelists here to start us off, and then if we could move to Kathleen next, and we'll ask Paul to wrap up the group for introductions.
Of course. Good morning, everyone. As Erin mentioned, my name is Victoria Mainprize. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Research, and I'm the General Counsel at the Canadian Credit Union Association, or CCUA. So CCUA is the National Trade Association for Canada's credit unions and Caisse Populaire and our centrals that operate outside of Quebec, which is one of our provinces. Our members hold collectively 330 billion in assets, and they serve more than 6 million Canadians, operating from over 1,600 locations across the country. And importantly, they're the only financial institution in more than 340 Canadian communities. Often those are smaller or rural communities. Collectively, our members are responsible for 21% of lending to small and medium-sized businesses in Canada. So the principle of concern for a community that guides our sector means that credit unions prioritize their members and they prioritize the communities that they serve. And this includes considering the financial and the strategic impacts of physical climate risks, both on their business and in assessing their business's impact on the environment and the climate. In recent years in Canada, the increasing frequency and severity of extreme weather events, including flooding, wildfires, heat waves, have affected communities across the country, and they pose enormous challenges for credit unions and their members. But climate-related risks not only impact Canadian communities, they also have the potential to significantly impact the safety and soundness of our financial institutions and the financial system more broadly. So in response to the changing environment and changing expectations and regulations, credit unions have taken some proactive measures in Canada to address climate-related risks and opportunities. This started at our 2020 annual general meeting, where our members adopted a resolution to establish a working group specifically to develop and publicize measurements that credit unions can use to track and disclose the carbon emissions impact of their portfolios. And this was guided by the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. In terms of educating our members, CCUA has developed a repository of climate change resources, and these include recordings of informational webinars that we've hosted. It includes climate disclosure frameworks and some flood protection information, also details on various aspects of climate risk and regulation. We've partnered also with the United Nations Environmental Program Finance Initiative to deliver and develop a presentation on climate risk and on the FSB's task force on climate-related financial disclosures. We also, to support our members, have developed an ESG and social purpose toolkit, a regional climate scenario analysis guide, and a materiality benchmarking report. And we also continue to advocate for our members as climate-related regulations are being developed. So Erin, back to you, or Kathleen, over to you.
Yep, Kathleen, that'd be great. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you. I will speak in português, tem? Right. Eu sou chefe adjunta do Departamento de Regulação Prudencial do Banco Central desde 2000. Antes disso, eu trabalhei um pouco na área de supervisão do Banco Central, ou seja, eu já estou aqui há muito tempo. Na área de regulação, eu trabalhei principalmente coordenando a implementação das recomendações do Comitê de Basileia no Brasil. Desde o início, desde Basileia 1, 2, 3, representei o país em vários grupos de trabalho sobre risco de mercado, risco operacional, etc. E desde 2020 eu represento também o Brasil na Task Force on Climate Related Risk do Comitê de Basileia. É importante dizer que o Banco Central do Brasil foi um dos pioneiros entre os bancos centrais a incorporar regras de sustentabilidade no arcabouço regulatório. Desde 2014, nós já temos uma política de regulação socioambiental, que foi aprimorada depois. E em 2021, a gente fez um aprimoramento bem reforçado e robusto no nosso arcabouço, trazendo vários aspectos para a regulação, como disclosure e requerimento relacionados à gestão de riscos. Dentro da instituição, nós temos também um comitê de sustentabilidade que coordena diversas ações entre os vários departamentos envolvidos, tanto internamente na instituição para reduzir a pegada de carbono do Banco Central, como também em ações externas, convênios internacionais, requerimentos específicos para os nossos regulados. Lembro que o ano de 2024 foi o ano mais quente da história e marcou a intensificação dos eventos climáticos extremos no Brasil e no mundo também, né? Mas no Brasil em particular nós tivemos uma seca severa na Amazônia e no Pantanal e as inundações históricas do Rio Grande do Sul. Esses episódios geraram prejuízos econômicos, sociais e ambientais bem significativos. As perdas giraram em torno de 5 bilhões de dólares para as fortes chuvas e em torno de 6 bilhões de dólares para as secas severas. E elas afetaram principalmente o setor de agrícola e a produção de energia. E nesse contexto, as cooperativas de crédito são um segmento extremamente importante. Elas possuem forte atuação na concessão de crédito para o setor agropecuário no Brasil. Por esse motivo, elas tendem a ser mais suscetíveis aos riscos climáticos e físicos, tanto físicos quanto de transição, independente do porte ou complexidade dos modelos de negócio, em virtude principalmente da concentração setorial e geográfica dos portfólios de crédito. Por isso, eu acredito que esse evento hoje é muito importante e oportuno. E obrigada por me convidarem a estar aqui.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. That was great. We're very excited to have you joining us in our credit union community as well. Paul?
Well, thanks, and welcome to everybody on the call, and especially to Victoria and Kathleen. And it's a real pleasure to be here. So let me just be very brief about what we're doing with respect to climate change at this stage, because what we're looking at is what's happening around the globe, and how we're involved directly is following what other countries are doing and trying to synthesize much of that. And we'll come to that later as we talk about some of the more specific issues. But the one point I wanted to raise just in the introduction was just some work that my colleagues, Aaron and our colleagues, have done here at WOKU, who work on project development, where late last year they worked on and published a study that was funded by by the Climate Finance Fund, that looked at the role of credit unions across the global South, which was really about advancing inclusive and climate finance. And what was really great about this study is that the size of the global South is immense. And that is just a part of the world that is in many ways disproportionately affected by what's happening with climate change. And the study really took a look at what the institutional structures are doing, what the governance looks like, how climate parameters are being incorporated into products and operations and things like that. And it's really quite an interesting place to start to get a sense of how the work of the credit union movement in that part of the world is really having an impact. And the report's available on our website, and it's a very good read. And I just encourage everybody to take a look at it, and wanted to commend our colleagues here at WOKU for spending the time and putting this report together. So let me leave it at that, Aaron, and we'll get into a few more specifics, I think, as we go.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Yeah. And as we're going through here in a second, I'll find the link that you just mentioned there and pop it into the chat so that folks are able to access that report that you just mentioned. A great call out. Well, I appreciate everyone taking some time here to start the discussion, to give those listening a sense of the different organizations we have represented here today and the different ways in which they interact and look at climate change, climate resiliency, and how that policy and the reality of that affects credit unions and the credit union industry. So as we're moving through the conversation today, I want to make sure that we're talking a little bit here about the broader shifts that we're seeing in climate policy. I also then want to make sure we've got time to cover where policy stands today, what some of those regulatory requirements are, what we see kind of looking ahead, and any recommendations from this group down the line on really what credit unions can do and incorporate into their planning and practices looking forward. So we've got a lot to talk through today, but I do want to start with some of those shifts. And Paul, I'm going to come back to you here. So as we're looking at this, sort of, you mentioned nicely that as international advocacy, as we're looking at the entire globe, at the entire world in terms of what they're doing, I think that might give you a better sense of the geopolitical challenges and the changes that are coming across globally. So I wonder if you could share with us, in terms of, as you're scanning the horizon and looking globally at this issue, have there been recent geopolitical shifts? What are you seeing out there in that area? And has that really impacted environmental policy for financial institutions? What do you see for credit unions from a geopolitical lens, but really from a global lens there?
It's challenging, I guess, is where I would start, and I would say in some parts of the world it's more challenging than in other parts of the world, and by that I mean uh, financial services and including credit unions are continuing the work of climate policy and climate addressing climate issues. Some parts of the world they're doing it in a quiet way, and some parts of the world are doing it in a more open and cooperative and I would say inclusive way. But I will say this for those listening is that international standard setting bodies like the Basel Committee, like the Financial Stability Board, see climate change as critical. And the Financial Stability Board, for example, sees climate risk as a financial stability risk and that it really does need to be addressed. And as I mentioned, some parts of the world are doing this quietly. They're addressing that, but in a more quiet way. In other parts of the world, in a little more open way. And I think Brazil's a great example of a real public-private cooperation of addressing these types of issues in a very collaborative and cohesive way. I will also say that, for example, the Basel Committee, which deals with capital issues, is also looking at climate and what are the impacts of climate and climate change and climate resiliency on capital requirements for financial institutions. So we need to be aware of this and we need to make our membership understand how climate is impacting these global standard setting bodies, but it's happening. And we just have to stay abreast of it, even though the geopolitics are making the discussion of it sometimes open and sometimes closed.
Well, thanks. Yeah, that's a great point that you mentioned too, in terms of how the international standard setters are interacting with this issue. And I think it also highlights the complexity of the issue, where there are a lot of layers, especially for financial institutions like credit unions, very concerned about the well-being of their community. There's a lot of layers to consider in terms of their own financial safety and soundness, their members' financial safety and soundness, the larger economic impacts as well. And I think just maybe carrying on with that point as well, I think this is a great time to turn to you, Kathleen, as you represent Brazil on the task force on climate related financial risks within the Basel Committee, which is, just very glad to have you here to share your insights in your work in that area as well, because I think that's a great example too of the work that's being done with international standard setters, but then impacting at a national country level as well. So I wonder if you could share a little bit about the work of the task force and what's been happening in that area.
Obrigada. Como o Paulo falou, esse é um esforço que é muito diversificado entre os países. Alguns são mais atuantes, outros menos. E o trabalho da Task Force foi bastante desafiador nesse sentido, porque havia esforços e intenções de diferentes maneiras. Mas foi uma tentativa de trazer para uma mesma mesa a discussão e tentar amenizar um pouco essas diferenças. A Task Force, a TFCR, né, Task Force on Climate Related Financial Risk, ela foi uma iniciativa do Comitê de Basileia e foi voltada para integrar o risco climático no arcabouço prudencial global, ou seja, trazer o clima, o risco climático, para dentro da lógica de capital, supervisão e gestão de riscos. Ela foi criada em 2020 e o objetivo principal era estudar como esse risco afeta tanto bancos como a estabilidade financeira e trazer recomendações internacionais a respeito. Sempre foi focado no mandato inicial em fazer um levantamento inicial sobre as práticas que os reguladores e bancos já tinham no contexto atual e fazer uma análise dos canais de transmissão, como esse risco afeta os demais riscos e trazer alguma informação sobre as metodologias de informação. Nesse sentido, foram publicados basicamente 5 documentos. Esses documentos foram publicados no site do BIS. O primeiro foi em 2020, trazendo esse levantamento inicial e mostrando que, apesar de já haver movimentos relevantes, eles eram bastante heterogêneos entre as jurisdições. O segundo e o terceiro foram publicados em 2021, trazendo informações sobre os drivers, os canais de transmissão desse risco para os demais riscos. E ele é bem fundamental porque conecta o clima ao framework tradicional do risco bancário. O outro, que foi publicado em 2021, trouxe informações, um resumo, um compêndio sobre as metodologias de mensuração, usada tanto pelos bancos como pelos supervisores, no caso, quem usava, principalmente para análise de cenários e testes de estresse. A conclusão mais importante desse documento foi que havia uma alta incerteza, uma falta de padronização e uma ausência drástica de dados para fazer mensurações. O quarto documento foi publicado em 2022, esse é um dos mais importantes, é um documento que traz 18 princípios de gestão e supervisão do risco climático. Desses 18, são 12 direcionados para bancos, instituições financeiras, e 6 para supervisores. E o último documento publicado ele foi feito primeiro uma consulta pública em 2024 e depois a versão final foi publicada em 2025, traz recomendações de disclosure, de transparência, requisitos de publicação para a sociedade dos bancos a respeito das exposições a risco climático. Esse documento foi bastante polêmico durante a sua elaboração e a versão final dele foi publicada numa versão opcional, ou seja, a, a, a opcionalidade ela pode ser exercida pelo regulador, não pelo regulado, ou seja, uma vez que o Banco Central decida adotar esse documento, torna-se uma regulação jurisdicional. Então, não é cada banco que decide se quer ou não adotar. No caso brasileiro, nós optamos por adotar de forma obrigatória, nós já tínhamos uma regulação semelhante em vigor, desde 2021, exigindo dos bancos publicação de informações qualitativas sobre governanças, políticas, estratégias, e nós tivemos uma evolução agora no ano passado, promovendo uma consulta pública que terminou esse ano, no início do ano, a consulta pública 127, incorporando todas essas tabelas padronizadas e que permite comparabilidade internacional no âmbito do Pilar 3, tanto do documento do Comitê de Basileia, mas também harmonizando com os documentos do ISSB nas demonstrações financeiras. É importante a gente não confundir na TFCR com a TFCD. A TFCD é uma Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosure, também trata de disclosure, mas ela foi constituída no âmbito do FSB e ela é voltada para mercados em geral, não exclusivamente para bancos, e já a TFCR, no caso do Comitê de Basileia, especificamente para bancos. O trabalho desenvolvido pela TSFR basicamente se encerrou agora no primeiro semestre de 2026 e está havendo uma transição para um outro tipo de trabalho, um outro grupo que agora vai ser focado em eventos severos de risco físico. É isso.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, and I think that really shows the breadth of the work, the amount of work that's been done over time. And hopefully folks have been able to look at those reports, be able to look at the information that's been compiled and shared. And I think that was also an interesting point around that evolution as this continues to evolve and be refined in terms of the work that the international standard setters are doing. And I think reinforces too what we're hearing in terms of the impact on financial stability overall in terms of that work. And so thank you so much for sharing that. And I wonder too, Victoria, as we kind of look at this sort of global perspective, are you seeing a similar evolution in terms of within Canada? Are you seeing that take place in terms of the climate related policies evolving over time as it relates to financial institutions and credit unions? And I wonder how you're thinking about that as you're advocating for appropriate policies and working to make sure that the lawmakers in Canada are thinking about credit unions and their perspective as they're designing some of these policies. I wonder if you could share a bit about what's going on in Canada with the group.
Thanks, Erin. So the short answer is yes, we are seeing similar things in the way that climate policies and regulations are developing in Canada. What I'll say is that for many years, climate risk and climate policies and regulation in Canada have been influenced very much by two things. The first, of course, is climate targets that are set by the provincial and federal governments that are designed to align with international standards. Kathleen mentioned many of those, so these will also include the ISSB and the Paris Agreement. Second, and of course, Basel standards. Second, responding to the fact that Canada is increasing significant exposure to natural hazards, and we're seeing a major increase in the frequency and the impact of flooding, heat waves, wildfires, windstorms, winter storms, and earthquakes across the country. So preparing for those. In terms of reacting to what's happening on the international level, so of course we know some countries, including the United States, has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement and the overarching UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Canada has not. And there's no indication that it will. In fact, we have a new prime minister, or for a year have had a new prime minister, and that's Mark Carney. And during his time as a central banker, he led the push on understanding climate risk. When he was the UN Special Envoy on Climate Risk and Finance, he focused on shifting global finance towards net zero and identifying climate change as a massive systemic financial risk, not just an environmental one. And that goes to Paul's comments. He advocated for mandatory climate risk disclosures, carbon pricing, and the mobilization of private capital to meet the Paris Agreement goals. Since he's become prime minister, of course, he has to take a slightly different focus. And he's now the prime minister of a country that is dealing with some economic and geopolitical issues. So he's now taken an approach that's aimed at managing both economic stability and emission reduction. So he's focusing on economic growth alongside environmental goals. However, his concern with managing climate-related risk among financial institutions and generally has not changed. Many of you likely know that in Canada, the way our country is structured, we have credit unions that are regulated either federally or provincially. And at the federal level, regulators are very much influenced by international practices and frameworks. At a provincial level, regulators are often in turn influenced by what they're seeing in federal guidance and by what they're seeing their peers do. Overall, of course, the principle for concern in our community guides our sector, which means that we're prioritizing members and the communities that we serve. That means credit unions need to consider the financial and strategic impact of climate risk. And they need to assess their business's impact on the environment and climate as well. However, Canadian credit unions vary greatly in their size and their operations, and they operate in different communities and in different geographic region, which means that each credit union will be at a different stage in its climate journey, and each credit union will have a slightly different focus on what it needs to address. As federal and provincial regulators in Canada began developing climate risk guidelines and approaches, CCUA, as the main advocacy body, has been actively advocating for two things. The first is proportionate, principles-based, and risk-based approaches that consider the unique risks and the vulnerabilities that vary with each institution's size, their nature, their scope, and their complexity, as well as their risk profile. And the second is looking for a national approach to integrating climate risk into capital and to regulatory frameworks, and for the development of better government databases and analytical tools to help with providing that data and the information that credit unions need to manage their climate risk.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's a really great example of at a national level having to look at what's going on globally, look at the international standard setters, but then think locally around what's actually possible in our environment. What are those risks that are specific to us? And Kathleen, I may shift back to you here with that segue from Victoria as we're talking about. I mean, you sit in a really unique seat because you're working on and discussing with other international and other national regulators at an international global level, but then also within Brazil, thinking about the unique situation that Brazil has and the unique risks that they're exposed to in their financial institutions. I wonder if you could share a bit about how Brazil in particular is adapting to the international standards, what their financial institutions are looking at, and how you're thinking about that locally within Brazil.
Ok, obrigada. Antes das recomendações internacionais começarem a ser publicadas nessa temática, nós já tínhamos nos antecipado. Em 2014, nós publicamos a primeira resolução estabelecendo uma obrigatoriedade que os nossos regulados tivessem uma política de responsabilidade social, ambiental e climática. Na época era socioambiental e agora nós aprimoramos esses conceitos nesse tripé, separando e definindo o risco social, ambiental e climático, por questões didáticas, para facilidade de identificação do risco, mas também entendendo como é que eles se relacionam. Em 2017, nós trouxemos uma complementação a essa regulação, incorporando o risco social, ambiental e climático na estrutura de gestão integrada dos riscos das instituições financeiras e alinhando as exigências para esses novos riscos da mesma forma que os requisitos já estavam em vigor para riscos mais tradicionais, como o risco operacional, de mercado e de crédito e de liquidez. Então, atualmente, nosso arcabouço incorpora na gestão integrada de risco requerimentos equivalentes para todos esses riscos. E o ano de 2021 também foi um ano de aprimoramento bem saliente desses normativos, porque nós trouxemos também a exigência de publicação das informações, a primeira exigência, né, que, como eu comentei, trata das informações mais qualitativas, e agora, no início deste ano, nós promovemos uma consulta pública para incorporar informações mais quantitativas, alinhadas tanto ao requerimento do Comitê de Basileia para disclosure, como também as recomendações do ISSB, S1, S2, que foram incorporadas já no nosso arcabouço, e as instituições financeiras já estão obrigadas a fazer a divulgação dessas informações em conjunto com as demonstrações. Então, nós continuamos aprimorando esse nosso arcabouço, nós temos a previsão de aprimorar os requisitos de disclosure agora no início do próximo semestre e mantendo esse alinhamento com o TSFD, com o ISSB e o BCBS. Ou seja, nossa agenda ainda não parou, ainda tem mais coisas por vir.
Oh, that's great to hear, and I think a really strong example of incorporating those international standards to a country level and thinking about that from your own country in terms of what needs to be adopted and included within there. So thank you very much for sharing. And we're going to shift here a little bit too. We've talked a lot about the evolution and how we got here in terms of policy. I want to shift a little bit to the current state of things and looking ahead a bit, but want to remind everyone too listening, you're welcome to put questions into the Q&A chat. I have lots and lots of questions for everyone on the panel here as I'm eager to learn more, but want to make sure that if there are questions out there from those attending that you're able to submit those into the Q&A box as well, and we will get to as many as possible. Paul, I want to come to you here as you are looking at the landscape of the international standard setters regarding climate considerations. I wonder if you could share a bit about an overview here. We've heard some great examples at a country level trying to adopt some of these evolving policies into there. But for those credit unions listening from other countries, I think it's helpful to get a sense, just an overview of the international standard setters and what they're thinking in terms of their considerations and policies for financial institutions, and a bit on your thoughts on how that impacts credit unions as you're scanning the global landscape.
Yeah, I think for from our perspective, it really boils down to two main things. One is, how will climate change impact the financial stability of any financial institution? Because if credit unions are making a great number of loans, for example, for homes or for other assets of members in their community, and those loans become non-performing because of climate change, it really risks the solvability of that credit union. And so the International Sustainability Standards Board that Kathleen mentioned earlier is about disclosure. And that's the other aspect that really matters here is, are credit unions and other financial institutions disclosing the impacts of climate change on their communities, on their operations, on their members? And so when you think about the IFRS, ISSB, Financial Stability Board, the Basel Committee, it's really about safety and soundness, financial stability, and it's really about disclosure. So do people really understand the position of the credit union? Do members really understand the position of the credit union because of the impacts of climate change? And that's what it comes down to in two broad buckets: financial stability and disclosure.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, I think that's a nice way of establishing those large buckets that the international standard setters are thinking through. Victoria, is that your experience in Canada as you're thinking about the current climate policy standards for credit unions? Are you seeing, I think there's always a challenge for credit unions in particular, as international standard setters are having these discussions. They're often thinking about large international banks, those with a very different risk profile or reach. And I wonder if you're seeing any similarities or differences too within the Canadian financial ecosystem between banks and credit unions, and just thinking through what that, I know that's a lot in that one question, but I wonder if you could share a bit on thinking through those current policy standards, given what Paul and Kathleen have shared from the international perspective, what that looks like within the financial ecosystem within Canada.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah, so as Kathleen and most recently Paul mentioned, the real focus in Canada, provincially and federally, continues to be from, on the one side, safety and soundness, and on the other, disclosure. So as I've mentioned, credit unions in Canada are regulated either provincially or federally. And Canadian regulators on the federal side, so bodies such as the Bank of Canada or the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, or OSFI, along with provincial authorities, collectively emphasize the importance of climate scenario analysis in safeguarding the financial sector against climate impacts. We have 4 federal credit unions or cooperative banks in Canada, and those are regulated by OSFI. And OSFI has established a climate risk management guideline that all federally regulated financial institutions, whether they're banks or federal credit unions or cooperative banks, are expected to follow. That guideline reflects OSFI's commitment to ensuring that our climate-related disclosure guidance remains interoperable with the corresponding requirements of first the CSSB, so the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, their standards, and those are closely aligned with the international baseline that's set by the ISSB. OSFI's guideline is principles-based, and it's implemented from a risk-based perspective, which is something that we've been advocating for. That's designed to allow each institution, regardless of its size or its operations, to be able to compete effectively while they manage their climate-related risks prudentially. So it will require credit unions to identify, to manage, to mitigate climate-related risks, and to conduct scenario analysis that understand or show they understand the impacts on risk profiles, on strategies, and on the credit union's business model or the financial institution's business model. Essentially, the OSFI guideline presents 3 outcomes that it expects all financial institutions that it regulates to achieve. The first is the institution needs to understand and mitigate against potential impacts of climate-related risks to its business model and its strategy. The second is that the institution needs to have appropriate governance and risk management practices to manage identified climate-related risks. And finally, the institution needs to be financially resilient through severe but plausible climate risk scenarios, and it needs to remain operationally resilient through disruption due to a climate-related disaster. As I'd mentioned before, often what we see at the provincial level is a recognition of what's happening at the federal level, which is often a recognition of what's happening internationally. So at the provincial level in Canada, many regulators have followed a very similar approach to natural catastrophe and climate-related risk. So both sides, and they require credit unions to establish and maintain a risk management framework. And that framework will include tools, policies, and processes that the credit union needs to use to identify, to assess, to quantify, control, and mitigate the risks. And those frameworks are essentially intended to enable the credit union to have a full understanding of its risk exposure and to ensure that the controls that it implements are appropriate given its strategic plan and its business and its operating environment. So not at all dissimilar to what we're seeing elsewhere.
Well, and I think that's a great point that you made there at the very beginning on the risk-based approach and the risk-based principles. And so I know a lot of other systems are looking at how do we advocate for and what is our goal in terms of climate related policies for our credit unions. And I think that's a great example of how that relates to kind of that risk-based proportionate approach and thinking about at an individual institution level, what's our framework? What's our response during natural disasters? What's our governance plan? What's our risk assessment? So I appreciate you sharing kind of that framework that's been established there in Canada, and sounds like it can give a lot of other countries a plan to think through in terms of what can be useful in their own home countries. And as we're thinking through this, I would be remiss, Kathleen, I mean, to have from your perspective on here, on as you're thinking about the oversight. So this is, we often look at this through a credit union lens and how difficult and challenging, which is true, to adopt some of these new practices and some of these policies. But it's also, I imagine, quite difficult from an oversight perspective. If you're responsible for financial stability and thinking about the well-being of the financial system within an entire country, to think about, okay, what do we need to focus on most? And that's a challenging proposition. So I wonder if you could share with us from an oversight perspective, what are you most concerned about regarding climate risks? What's at the top of your mind as you're thinking about challenges from a supervisory perspective, related to climate resilience for financial institutions?
Ok. Eu penso que as principais preocupações e desafios relacionados aos riscos climáticos decorrem da complexidade de estimar com precisão os impactos desses riscos na economia e no setor financeiro, devido ao alto grau de incerteza e à não linearidade desses riscos. A resiliência climática do sistema financeiro, ela é indissociável da integridade da precificação dos ativos. E nesse sentido, eu mencionaria primeiramente 3 preocupações específicas relacionadas aos modelos de mensuração. Primeiro, a inadequação dos modelos históricos. Os modelos de risco tradicionais, eles se baseiam em séries históricas. O risco climático, porém, ele é prospectivo e não linear. O passado já não serve mais como um guia confiável para prever a frequência e a severidade dos eventos climáticos futuros. E dessa forma, eu penso que é essencial no gerenciamento desses riscos que as instituições financeiras empreguem ferramenta de análise de cenários. A segunda preocupação específica diz respeito ao horizonte temporal. Ele é desalinhado com os demais riscos, é o famoso conceito da tragédia no horizonte. O ciclo de planejamento financeiro costuma ser de 3 a 5 anos nas instituições financeiras, enquanto os impactos climáticos severos, eles podem se manifestar em 10, 20, 30, 50 anos. E então, incentivar as instituições financeiras a gerenciar os riscos hoje, em vez de adotar riscos de longo prazo, é um desafio regulatório constante. E o terceiro, a preocupação específica, diz respeito à escassez e baixa granularidade dos dados. Por exemplo, para estimar com precisão os riscos físicos que se traduzem em risco de crédito, é necessário que a instituição financeira conheça a localização geográfica exata do ativo do cliente, que são os dados georreferenciados. E se a gente pensar num sentido um pouco mais amplo, os riscos climáticos relacionados à natureza, de modo geral, eles apresentam uma peculiaridade que os distingue dos demais riscos tradicionalmente tratados na regulamentação, que é a originação do risco diferente de quem efetivamente sofre os impactos do risco, geralmente o agente exposto. Quando há emissões de gases de efeito estufa, por exemplo, não se sabe exatamente quem sofrerá os efeitos da mudança do clima. Quando o desmatamento, ainda que legal, ainda que dentro da lei, quando ele avança, ocorre o mesmo. A complexidade da natureza dificulta a modelagem dos encadeamentos, mesmo os principais, que determinam quando, onde, quem e em que extensão os riscos vão se materializar. Nós temos avançado na ótica do risco assumido pela instituição financeira, contudo, é fundamental reconhecer que a originação do risco é crucial. Imaginemos a construção de instalações industriais financiadas direto ou indiretamente por uma instituição financeira, por exemplo. As emissões e o desmatamento prévio da área representam a originação do risco. Ao prover ou levantar recursos para essa empresa ou atividade, as instituições financeiras participam do início da cadeia. Ao mesmo tempo, as instituições financeiras também se encontram no final dessa cadeia, já que a rentabilidade depende de agentes econômicos, tanto empresas quanto pessoas, que por sua vez dependem de um ambiente climático e ambiente equilibrado. Né? Olhar apenas para as instituições financeiras do risco da perda no final do processo transmite uma impressão incorreta de que esse problema ainda vai demorar a se tornar relevante. No Brasil, nós tentamos adotar uma abordagem que considera tanto o risco quanto a responsabilidade, a política de responsabilidade da instituição financeira. Então, nós tentamos tratar de forma integrada os aspectos climáticos, ambientais e sociais, que são particularmente relevantes para um país emergente. E, embora tenhamos essa abordagem dupla e integrada, nós precisamos, assim como o resto do mundo, buscar um equilíbrio adequado entre a causa do problema e os seus efeitos, entre a originação e a exposição às suas consequências. Na dimensão climática, tem uma dimensão de ação coletiva, que está em primeiro plano. Diferentemente, por exemplo, da crise financeira do subprime, que essa dimensão emergiu como uma exceção, uma decorrência de múltiplas estruturas potencializaram uma má originação ocorrida na concessão de crédito. Essa lógica peculiar não se restringe ao clima, mas se aplica a todas as questões relacionadas à natureza que são relevantes para o planeta. Neste contexto, temos agentes que seguem no business as usual, né? Agentes que alertam para um grande desmoronamento com base na ciência, agentes que promovem uma grande virada sustentável, desenvolvendo negócios positivos para o clima e para a natureza. E as cooperativas de crédito, elas nasceram de laços de solidariedade, com a ambição de organizar um mundo social e economicamente melhor. Partindo de uma compreensão clara desse desafio global, elas têm um grande potencial para estar mais bem posicionadas nesse processo de transformação. Há, inclusive, evidências de que bancos com maior comprometimento com políticas de responsabilidade apresentam não apenas melhor desempenho em ratings ESG e de sustentabilidade, mas também menor custo de capital, colhendo benefícios financeiros mensuráveis que vão além de ganhos que são meramente reputacionais. É isso.
Oh, yes. Thank you for that response. There's so much great information packed into that one response. And I have to say, I really appreciate hearing, some of those top three concerns. And it's, I think, educational to understand so much of those really derives from this exchange of information to be able for the credit union and whoever's responsible for oversight to be able to understand and share information back and forth, to be able to disclose what's happening with the complexity of whether it's a natural disaster or the existing climate and the environment that they're dealing with. But I have to say, I very much appreciate, and I think that resonates with this audience in particular in terms of as we're having these discussions, it's very easy to focus on, okay, how do we address the risks that are forced upon us from climate change and from the changing environment? And how are we adapting as a financial institution to policies out there, and new requirements and new regulations? But there's also the other side that is very important in terms of how do we help the community address this? How do we come together to work together to address climate change and to become more resilient as communities, to think about the social impact going forward? And so I appreciate you highlighting that, as I think that's the other piece that credit unions are really grappling with, of how do we also, while managing the financial risks that we're responsible for, think about products and services and what our credit union members need to be able to deal with this reality that we're living in. So I appreciate you highlighting both of those. And I think it's encouraging to hear that that discussion's happening from a regulatory perspective as well, and from a supervision perspective. We've had a couple of questions coming in. I don't know if there's the perfect spot to fit this in, but I want to make sure, as we've had a couple of questions talk about, these do impact loan portfolios. They are thinking about not only new future services to offer, but existing loans, as I think Paul mentioned at the beginning, they have collateral attached to them that can be impacted by natural disasters. They have members that experience unique situations that can affect the quality of their loan portfolio or the ability to repay for members within that loan portfolio. And that really is part of that. It's a very specific example of the larger risk situation that credit unions are having to assess throughout this climate resilience. And, I'll open up this to the panel in case there are any comments on that. But do you see credit unions, any best practices in how they're thinking about, okay, we have our existing loan portfolio, but we have to, assess we assessed it on an individual level when we underwrote the loan, but now we have a loan portfolio where climate has changed, where risks may have changed, and we need to think about what's our overall risk with our current loan portfolio. Has anyone seen any best practices for credit unions or financial institutions as they're looking at the quality of their loan portfolio and how maybe climate change and climate risks are impacting, that individual assessment? And I know this is a unique one. Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say that it's not a question that we at Woku have looked at in any detail. So it just opens up sort of a line of inquiry for us that I think maybe would be helpful to take a look at in terms of what others are doing around the world in this area, because it's not a unique problem to one system versus another. It's certainly a problem that will be common given the types of climate effects that are impacting everyone. So I appreciate the question. I just don't have a good answer for you today, and it's something we're probably going to need to look into.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think, there's so many different facets to that. We've also seen questions around, okay, now the natural disaster is hit, and that does impact, we can see a finite, and Kathleen, I think you spoke a little bit about this as well, that you can see after a natural disaster, the financial impact that it has within a community and the concern for the financial stability that results from those natural disasters and what happens to a loan portfolio. And I know we've seen a couple examples worldwide where the credit unions especially have really worked with their members to adjust payment plans, to think about alternative ways to support their member during a financial challenge, whether it's, forbearance and delaying payments and working with other grant options to help support, the financial stability of that member, but also rebalance, the overall risk. I think post a natural disaster, we've also seen credit unions change their risk assessments, of their loan portfolios as well. But completely agree. Kathleen, Victoria, feel free to jump in if there's anything else to add on that. But think this is another area that we're going to continue to see evolving and more research done as credit unions are really grappling with, how do we address, loan challenges following a natural disaster. Yeah.
Uau,
Kathleen?
yeah. Como vocês disseram, como vocês mencionaram, é muito importante que nós consideremos que essa agenda está longe de estar completa, né? Ainda há muito o que fazer, né? Eu penso que, por exemplo, nas cooperativas de crédito, não apenas elas, mas os regulados de modo geral do sistema financeiro precisam evoluir nessas três trajetórias. A trajetória de responsabilidade social, ambiental e climática, de ser proativo e ter políticas internas que contribuam para o bem-estar social, ambiental e para a preservação do meio ambiente, diversificação da natureza, né, preservando a diversificação. Penso que a segunda trajetória que se precisa manter e evoluir é a de gestão de riscos, né? Atento para os impactos que esses riscos trazem na estabilidade, nos resultados, e ter um planejamento não apenas de curto, mas médio e longo prazo nesse sentido. E a terceira, que é uma das que eu considero mais importante, a evolução do disclosure, da transparência, reduzindo a simetria de informação, promovendo maior disciplina de mercado e incorporando toda a sociedade no conhecimento sobre as ações das instituições financeiras, que são um canal tão importante para o financiamento, para o mercado, para uma economia de baixa transição. Obrigada.
Yeah. Thanks, Kathleen. I think that's also a great answer to kind of what's ahead in terms of this next kind of preparation step for credit unions and financial institutions as they're preparing to address, these issues that we've been discussing today. And I know we just have a couple minutes left, and so I really appreciate this conversation that we've been having today. I want to make sure that there's just one final comment that we can make for each of our panelists here. And Paul, if you want to kick us off as you're thinking about what WOKU's doing, about the future ahead, to share any final thoughts.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I'm very happy to say that up until today, we didn't have a view, or we didn't take a firm view on issues around climate change. But today we published a policy statement on behalf of WOKU that talks about advancing climate resilience and sustainability through cooperative finance. And what this policy statement does is three things. It lays out our commitment as an organization, what we intend to do. It lays out what we see as the risks and the resilient nature and the opportunities of climate finance. And then the third aspect of the policy statement deals with the critical role that credit unions play in this arena. And we're very, very pleased that we were able to come to a good place when it comes to thinking about how we can play a role, since we all have a role to play in advancing the climate discussion. I'll put the link to the statement and the press release that we issued this morning. And I hope everyone has a chance to take a look at it, and just something that we're very, very pleased to have been able to accomplish. So thanks, Aaron, for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And I hope folks are able to use the QR code there, and hopefully it's helpful in your own national kind of efforts as well in your local credit unions. Victoria, any final words?
A few final words. Thanks, Erin. The first is we've talked a lot about climate risk, but climate change also presents a number of opportunities to credit unions, and those should be identified and assessed as well as the risks. The second is that different transition and physical risks are likely to evolve based on regional and sectoral exposure. So make sure you know what's happening in your area. When you're advocating for regulation, advocate for regulation that's proportionate, principles-based, and risk-based. Look for areas where, if there's different regulation across your country or in the jurisdictions you operate in, try to look for a sort of more national or harmonized approach. Development of government databases and analytical tools will be key, so advocate for those. But my final comment is all credit unions will be at different stages in their climate journey. So there is definitely need for regulatory proportionality, clarity, and guidance. There's definitely more need for training and capacity building. There's also need for shared resources, tools, and knowledge platforms. And Paul has talked about, how WOCU can help in some of those areas. But the other is recognize that you're at a different stage in your journey, and wherever you are, there's still room to grow, but don't be intimidated if you're at the very beginning.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Kathleen, just a final thank you. And if you have any wrap up thoughts, we're so grateful for this ongoing dialogue. So yeah, please, any final thoughts from you?
Sem tomar muito tempo, só agradecer, e eu não posso dizer diferente do que foi dito pela Victória. Nós temos que considerar na regulamentação das cooperativas uma regulamentação que preserve os princípios de proporcionalidade e flexibilização que essas instituições demandam pelo perfil diferenciado que elas têm dentro do sistema e pelo papel que representam nessa temática. Muito obrigada.
Yes. Well, and thank you so much for sharing that perspective from Brazil and from the central bank. And big thank you to Victoria and Paul as well. I think this has been a great dialogue. I know that we should have this recording out for folks that weren't able to join for the whole time. We went the full hour, so thank you to everyone for sticking around here for the end. And Liz, I think we're ready to sign off, but just another thank you to our three panelists and those that were able to join us today.